Oxford University Press Higher Education Webinars. And now, Oxford is proud to present Jeff Mio, Applying the Identity Development Model to My Life.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning to some of you. I guess good afternoon to you on the East Coast. I thought if you've used my book, you know that one of the things I like to do is reinforce the concepts that multicultural researchers have found by student narratives. And so what I thought I'd do is take an important concept in the book, which is on the identity development model, and apply it to my life so you could see kind of my transition from essentially being unaware to being aware about multicultural issues. And so, there it goes. So here's the agenda. I'm first going to talk about my early years, and then I'm going to relate it to the minority identity development model. And the model I'm going to be using is a four-stage model. It was kind of one of the very first models proposed by William Cross. And the reason why I like to use this model is because there's a parallel model that was developed by Joe Ponerato on majority identity development. So I kind of like to do the parallels between those two. And in my mind, the four-stage model is kind of the basic model, and then there are some five-stage models, like, for example, Daryl Wing Su's model. The fifth stage is between the third and fourth stages of this model, and then the sixth-stage model essentially has that plus, in addition, after the fourth stage of this model, community activism. So this is the basis for all of the other stages. Then I'm going to talk about how I really got into multicultural psychology almost by accident, and you'll learn certain encounters that I had, and I made lemonade out of lemons, and so finally lessons learned. So first of all, in my early years, I grew up in an area called Bloomington, which is an incorporated city of Los Angeles. If any of you know the Los Angeles area, Bloomington is the Los Angeles harbor. That's where everything is unloaded here. So it was a working class area. Very few Asians. When I was growing up, it was probably about half white, half Latino. Almost no Asians, almost no African Americans, and almost no American Indians, at least not that I was aware of. Well, as I mentioned, Wilmington is near Long Beach, and so the nearest Buddhist church to us was the Long Beach Buddhist Church. And so throughout my early years, I was doing cultural things. I was obviously aware that I was of Japanese descent. My grandparents lived with me, or lived with us, and they basically only spoke Japanese. I did not speak Japanese. So things either had to be translated through my parents, or my grandparents did have some broken English, and so we were able to communicate a little bit. But while I was aware that I was of Japanese descent and Asians in a broader context in the United States, I tried to keep that separate from me when I was at school. My elementary school was Gulf Avenue School, and again, Gulf Avenue was a reflection of our area, that it was about half white, half Latino. I did have a couple of Japanese American friends, at Gulf Avenue School. But, you know, that was my early exposure. I didn't really encounter, oops, okay, now I know where I'm going. When I was at Gulf Avenue School, I was identified as kind of promising or something. And in those days, what that meant was that I had to take an extra class. I had to go to school an hour and a half early and do this enrichment class. And the enrichment class involved studying the social sciences. And we had to do a term paper. And my earliest memory was my grandfather sitting me on his lap saying, "What do you want to be when you grow up? You want to be a doctor, don't you?" And I kept resisting. I didn't have any interest being a doctor. But I kept remembering having this burden that, you know, when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, I had to choose what I was going to be when I grew up. And so when I was in this enrichment class in the 5th grade, I did my term paper on psychology, and this is what got me interested in psychology. I was looking through some books and on psychology. I didn't know what I was looking for, and I came across this optical illusion, and this fascinated me. I don't know if you could see this, but these blocks change from 6 blocks to 7 blocks. It just kind of flips back and forth. Sometimes when I present this in class, my students can't see it, so just in the interest of time, I'll point out the blocks in case you can't see it. The 6 block cube starts with 1 at the top, then 2, then 3, with these black diamonds being at the top of the boxes. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the 7 block one has the black diamonds at the bottom. So here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And this optical illusion just fascinated me, and so I decided right then and there that I wanted to be a psychologist. I still don't know why it flips back and forth like this. But so what ended up happening was that I had all of this burden lifted off my shoulders, thinking that now I knew what I wanted to do. So I proudly went to my grandfather and said I wanted to be a psychologist. And it sounded impressive enough that he left me alone. So here I am. I don't know how many years, let's see, you know, close to 50 years later. When I went to Wilmington Junior High, this was my first exposure to large numbers of African Americans, because there was an area near, kind of on the border between Wilmington and Carson. And Carson was a new city, and they had a new high school in that area, and so a lot of people went from my high school, which is Banning High, over to Carson. And I think looking back, there was probably some racism going on here, because they wanted to keep Carson kind of a white school. And so there was an area that had a lot of African Americans in it, and those African American kids were bused both to Wilmington Junior High and also to Banning High later on. You can see that on, as my next highlight. But Wilmington was my first exposure to African Americans, and so, you know, my multicultural world began expanding from there. And so when I went to Banning High, while at Wilmington Junior High I had exposure to African Americans, I was still kind of tracked into some of these classes, and I didn't have a lot of African American classmates in my actual classes. Whereas when I went to Banning High and I started becoming a little bit athletic, I was joining athletic teams. This was the first time that I really had close exposure, because I had to African American kids, because they were my teammates. I played basketball. I was in track. I was on the swimming team, and we even had a number of African American swimmers on our team. So this was my first really close encounters with African American kids. I remember this one guy in particular, John Williams. I was just standing on the basketball court, and all of a sudden something flew over my head. And what had happened was that he ran up behind me, he jumped up, he put his hands on my shoulders and leapfrogged me, and I was standing straight up, and I thought, wow, this guy's really athletic. And, you know, we had a lot of fun together. So that was my first exposure. It was also looking back as an adult, and one of the things I try to do when I'm talking with undergraduates is to talk about your mistakes, to talk about your subtle racism, your covert racist ideas, because one of the things I want people to know is that we all have stereotypes and follow racist ideas and stuff that's in the media. It becomes part of the air that we breathe. If any of you have seen the movie The Color of Fear, that was one of the lines there, that racism is in the air that we breathe. Some of you sports fans may know that the only quarterback ever to lead the Los Angeles Rams to the Super Bowl was a guy named Vince Ferragamo. Well, Vince Ferragamo was in my class in high school, and so I was talking to Rico, the guy who was a year behind me, and Banning High went far. We almost won the city championship that year. We ended up losing in the playoffs. But on that high school team, there were 4 players that ended up playing in the NFL, and Vince Ferragamo was the most famous of them. And so I turned to my friend Rico and I said, "Oh, you poor guy, Banning's not going to have a good football team next year." And he says, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, you don't have any quarterbacks to replace Vince." And Rico said, "Well, how about Reggie?" And I said, Reggie can't be a quarterback." And Rico said, "Well, why not? He's fast, he has a good arm, makes quick decisions. I think he'd be a great quarterback." And I said, "But Reggie's black, and blacks can't be quarterbacks." And, you know, we're talking about the early 1970s, and that was the prevailing wisdom. I didn't know why people said blacks couldn't be quarterbacks. Of course, later on I found out it was more for racism reasons. But I was just parroting what everybody was saying. At that time, there were no African American quarterbacks in the NFL, nor were there any African American quarterbacks leading any major college teams. So it seemed to me that African Americans couldn't be quarterbacks. I didn't know that there was a racist undertone to that. So, you know, I talk about that to my class so that they see that here they have the instructor of their multicultural class, a guy who wrote the book on multicultural psychology, and you know, I'm not perfect. We all have these racist types of ideologies. One of the things right now, if some of you follow sports, you know that there is a phenomenon with Jeremy Lin. I read this interview with Jeremy Lin, and Lin said, "Well, they say that I'm deceptively quick." Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that they think Asians are slow and so I'm quicker than they think that Asians should be? So those types of subtle thoughts still prevail. Okay, then I went from Banning High to UCLA, And at UCLA, I got further into now not only being teammates with African Americans, but I lived on UCLA's campus in the residence halls. And so now I was living with a whole range of people, not just African Americans, but I began being exposed to other types of cultures, Jewish cultures, Middle Eastern, other Middle Eastern cultures, Eastern European cultures. I really had a fairly large panoply of people. I remember playing basketball in Poly Pavilion, and there was this African American, or I'm sorry, there was this black man on the court who was speaking with this really thick English accent, and so kind of it exposed me to, that was my first exposure to someone who was black who was from England. And then you have Caribbean cultures and people from Africa. I had a roommate from Hong Kong, so it was really an exposure of living in a community with different cultures. So that's further expanding my my development along these lines. Then I went to Long Beach State University for my master's degree, and let's see, I actually don't think I have any stories about Long Beach State. It was a great place for me to mature and to really get prepared for graduate school, but nothing I can really recall being relevant to multicultural psychology, but I thought I'd give a shout out to one of my previous universities. Then I got my Ph.D. at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and as a graduate student, now you have a really intense experience with a lot of different people, but I still didn't have this identity other than knowing that I was Japanese, or of Japanese descent, knowing that I went to Long Beach Buddhist Church, but I really didn't have my identity as an ethnic minority firmly established. I was still in essentially stage one. And I remember my my advisor, Roger Dominowski, telling me, you don't want to do a dissertation on ethnic minority issues. And I asked him why. And he said, well, if you do that, then that's too limiting, that people will only see you as an ethnic minority psychologist. They won't see you as a psychologist. And so I said, okay. And so, I was just accepting that. And he was giving me what he thought was caring advice. He wanted me to make an impact in psychology, and he didn't think I could do that by being a multicultural psychologist. I might add that ethnic minorities took on this identity as well. I became friends with Maria Root, and some of you know that Maria Root is probably the world's foremost authority on multiracial individuals. And she said that her advisor was Stanley Hsu, one of the biggest names in multicultural psychology. And Stanley Hsu had given her the notion that she doesn't want to be just seen as a multicultural psychologist. He said, develop an area outside of multicultural psychology so that you will have more versatility. And so she became versed in eating disorders, and she's one of the leading eating disorder therapists in the Seattle area, as well as being good at multicultural and multiracial psychology. Okay, so now let's apply the minority identity development model and the first stage. And some of you also know that people don't call these stages anymore. They call them statuses, because a stage essentially kind of boxes you in, whereas status just means it's a temporary label at that time. But this was the original language. So in the pre-encounter stage, individuals are programmed to perceive and think of the world as being non-minority or anti-minority and act in ways that devalue their minority development. And as I had mentioned, applying this to my own life, I was in the pre-encounter stage as a graduate student. And so I agreed with Roger, who was a caring person who wanted me to make an impact in psychology. But I agreed that I shouldn't study multicultural psychology because I wouldn't be taken seriously as a general psychologist, that I would only be kind of boxed in as a multicultural psychologist. Then you have an encounter stage, and this is where individuals begin to gain awareness of what it means to be minority, and they begin to validate themselves in terms of minority identity. And so this was when I was a professor at Washington State University. I was still in the pre-encounter stage, that I really didn't have a minority identity internalized within me. And I taught a multicultural course, so I was exposed to the material, but I was still trying to keep that away from my own identity. But we had a men's conference at Washington State, and this one philosopher, a guy named Harry Brode, came, and he was the keynote presenter at this men's conference, and he talked about securing one's own identity. And he said, so it's important for me as a Jewish man to pay attention to my Jewish heritage, just as it's important for people of Asian descent to pay attention to Asian identity, and people of Latino descent to pay attention to Latino identity, people of African American descent to pay attention to African American identity, people of American Indian descent to pay attention to American Indian identity. And so because Brode was such a powerful speaker, and he also talked about the importance of owning one's identity, it essentially gave me permission, or allowed me to realize the importance of this area. So this was really my encounter. A lot of times encounters can be negative, like you experience racism so you can no longer ignore that racism exists, or sometimes it could be positive. And this is a positive encounter that I had that really kind of blocked the log jam that I had in my mind. And then you have this immersion stage, and this is where individuals reject all non-minority values and fully immerse themselves in minority culture. And you know, I grew up in the 60s, and I remember that era, and I remember how a lot of African Americans who were this was the transition from an identity of being Negro to the identity of being black. And so I remembered seeing the blacker than thou type of competition that a lot of African Americans had at that time. Well, you know, I'm blacker than you. I read Malcolm X. Oh yeah, well, I'm more black than you are because I read Malcolm X twice. Oh yeah, well, I'm blacker than you because I read Malcolm X while wearing a dashiki. Oh yeah, well, and so there was going back and forth. And so people were trying to be blacker than thou. For me, I wasn't trying to be more Asian than others, but while I did not reject non-Asian values, I became more involved with Asian communities and values. And there was a local Asian group in the area, and I became a lot more involved with them, and started contributing more to Asian American causes and stuff. Okay, and then in the internalization stage, individuals develop a secure and self-confident minority identity and are also comfortable expressing preferences and interests for experiences from non-minority cultures. And part of the problem with the the previous stage with this immersion stage is that if we're talking about minority identity development, if your identity is based upon a comparison with someone else, that's not a real internalized identity you have. You don't have an identity unless you can compare it with someone else. Whereas if you get to the stage where you can internalize it, then you have an identity. The other problem with the with this immersion stage, if you're rejecting everything that is not part of your own community, what ends up happening is that if you are truly a minority, then if you reject people from the majority, you end up losing potential allies that give you access to resources in the majority culture and community that you otherwise would not have had. I remember this thing that Malcolm X had said, that the worst thing he did was reject this one white woman who was saying how much she believed in his cause and she wanted to help, and she said, "What can I do to help you?" And he said, "Nothing," and he just brushed her off. And if you saw the movie Malcolm X, they depicted that, but he later regretted having done that and said that she was a person who had access to the white community and had resources that could potentially help his cause, and he rejected that. So those are the two reasons for advancing to the internalization stage. Number one, it doesn't make any sense that your identity is based upon a comparison to someone else, as opposed to being satisfied yourself with an internalized identity. And number two, rejecting resources that could potentially be beneficial to you and your community. So for me, when I developed a strong sense of self, I was also developing an interest in jazz. And also we had a fairly active modern dance troupe and company that was in the Washington State region. I actually ended up becoming chairman of the board that brought in these dance groups like Alvin Ailey and other types of famous modern dance groups. So, those are certainly not Asian forms of entertainment, jazz and modern dance, but I liked them, and it didn't threaten my own Asian identity. Whereas if I were still in this immersion stage, liking things outside of my own ethnicity might threaten my sense of self. Once you have a strong sense of self, it allows you to appreciate people and items from other cultures. Okay, so as I had said, Joe Ponerato developed an equivalent majority identity development model. And so this is a four-stage model. So the minority identity development model said that you had a pre-encounter stage. The majority identity development model calls it a pre-exposure stage. So little thought has been given to multicultural issues or to one's own role as a majority group member in a society that has had a history of racism and oppression, the remnants of which are still being felt today. I'm kind of a political junkie, and I was watching this political program, and this is just before the South Carolina primaries earlier, just last month. And this one guy from South Carolina said that his sister had a Barack Obama sign on her front lawn in the 2008 election, and all of these real estate agents told her to take it down because she's driving down the price of the houses in her neighborhood by putting up that sign. So you could see how there are these remnants of racism still being felt today. A lot of times people say everyone is the same and I treat people as people. I don't see race. And I actually had a graduate student say to me, Jeff, I don't see you as Asian, I just see you as a person. And my response to that was, that's the equivalent of me saying, I don't see you as a woman, I see you as a person. Well, that doesn't make sense because being a woman was part of her identity. And so if I'm denying seeing an important aspect of her identity, why is she denying me seeing an important part of my identity? I'll let you read this on your own, but the exposure stage is essentially when people are exposed to the realities of the history of racism in this country. And when I talk to my students about this, I talk about the Great Compromise of the Constitutional Congress, Constitutional Convention of 1787. And I asked them what the Great Compromise is, and almost no one remembers their U.S. history. And then I tell them, well, there are two compromises. The first was that the larger states wanted to be represented by the number of people, and the smaller states wanted to be represented equally. And so one of the compromises was that we'd have two houses of Congress. One, which they would call the House of Representatives, would be represented by the number of people in the state, and the other, which they will call the Senate, will have equal representations for the states. Well, one of the things that happened, so that was the first compromise, but then the second compromise was, well, the southern states were larger, so they wanted more representation, and they said, well, we have these slaves, they don't have full person status, but we want to count them as full person status. And the northern states said, well, that's not fair, you shouldn't do that. And so they're bickering back and forth between if they should be counted towards representation or not. And so that compromise was that slaves would be counted, or African Americans would be counted as 3/5 of a human being, just for representation purposes. I also point out that this was sexist too, because the only people who could make laws that govern our lives were landowners. And although gender was not explicitly in the Constitution, the only people at that time who could own land were the white males. So this is a lot of students' first exposure to these issues in a meaningful way. And so then they have one of two reactions. They become zealots because they're outraged at what has happened, and so they become kind of the white equivalent of being blacker than thou. They try to say, well, I'm more aware than you. You know, I took Dr. Mio's class, and someone else could say, oh yeah, well, I'm more aware than you because I donate to all of these other causes. Oh yeah, well, I'm whiter than you, or more aware than you because I marched in this parade. And so it becomes, again, other focused. Or they could develop defensiveness about them. And so they try to only have contact with members of their own culture, or they try to point out all of the concessions that have been made to ethnic minority cultures. So some might say, well, at least I'm taking a multicultural course, so I'm more aware than most of my friends. And as I had said, with the immersion stage for minority identity, if your identity is based upon a comparison to someone else, then that really doesn't mean that you have personally developed that sense of identity, that your identity is dependent upon someone else as opposed to your own internal process. So there is a force to go, or a pressure to go up to the integration stage the overall strong feelings of the zealot defensive stage subside, and a more balanced view takes its place. Instead, a deeper appreciation of one's own culture allows one to have a secure, confident identity, allowing for appreciation of other cultures. One is able to accept differences both intellectually and emotionally. And I tell students that, for example, when or my own development in dealing with the LGBT community, you know, initially it was okay for me to be an advocate for lesbian individuals because that didn't really kind of threaten me. As a heterosexual male, to me it was more intimidating to advocate for gay male rights and stuff because, you know, you have that homophobic feeling of, gee, I wonder if people will then think that I'm gay, or, you know, so I had those types of feelings. And so intellectually, I knew that it was a community that I should support, but emotionally, I still had some baggage there. But once, you know, I developed a secure sense of self, and, you know, then that allowed me to think, well, if they think I'm gay, so what? You know, it doesn't affect my own sense of self. And so once you get a strong sense of your own self, then you don't have those fears of losing your identity. And so some might say, I now know not to say, I've already dealt with this material because I know that this is a lifelong process to unlearn, and that I had previously learned about issues of race. What I mean by this is that racism is something that is ongoing. So you don't say, okay, I've already dealt with it, I don't have to deal with racism anymore. It keeps popping up. And so if someone is truly non-racist, and for example, if they're accused of racism or something, someone who's still in the zealot defensive stage will be defensive, and they'll say, no, I'm not racist, I don't have a racist bone in my body, and that would be their reaction. But someone who is truly non-racist would stop and think, oh, I wonder what I did to make them think that I was racist. If it was really something that I did that was subtly racist, I need to change that in myself. If it wasn't, and it was a misperception on their part, then, you know, I have a secure sense of myself, and I know that it may have been their misperception. So that's what kind of a truly non-racist would say. And they won't be stymied by any emotional baggage. They will have had a secure sense of self, which will allow them to examine themselves. I mean, that's why I try to let people know that that I make mistakes, and so if I make mistakes, I need to evaluate what mistakes I made and to try to correct them. Okay, I see that we're running a little bit out of time. All of you know about Peggy McIntosh's white privilege, and it's in my book and stuff like that. And so I won't really go through all of these things, but what I also want to point out is that I kind of proposed some equivalents to Peggy McIntosh about male privilege, and I could always assume that my opinion will be listened to and respected. As a male, I can look at nearly every major corporation in the world and know that my gender will be represented at the very top levels. I know that if I'm promoted to the top levels of my company, it won't be attributed to my company needing that gender at the top to show progress. Women always relate to this. If I'm in a bad mood, I know that people won't attribute it to that time of month. I mean, if you think about it, what you're doing is you're discounting women's anger at things by brushing it off and saying it must be that time of month. For men, if I do any housework at all, I will get credit for being such a good husband, even if it's only 15% of the total work, which statistically is true. Men do about 15% of the work. And it tends to be cyclical. It tends to be like every once in a, like once a week you take out the trash, or once every week or two you mow the lawn. Whereas for women, it tends to be constant housework, doing the dishes every day, doing the laundry often, vacuuming often, dusting often, cleaning the toilet. It tends to be stuff that happens all the time, whereas for men, it tends to be stuff that only happens every once in a while. And then if I do any child rearing at all, see above, that men get credit for taking care of the kids while the wife gets to go out and go to the gym for an hour or something like that. Whereas then when she comes back, the man hands the children to the women again and say, okay, they're all yours again. Okay, so for me, my first professional job was at Cal State Fullerton. And the week before classes were going to begin, it turned out that someone we hired to teach our newly formed multicultural course decided not to come to campus. And so the chair of my department, who really, really liked me, I'm not kidding, she thought the world of me, but, you know, she kind of did a racist thing here. She said, well, you're the only one who could teach this multicultural course, and the subtext here is because you're an ethnic minority, so obviously you must know how to teach multicultural psychology. Number one, you wouldn't tell someone a week before classes were going to begin that they have to teach a brand new prep course. And then number two, I had not had a multicultural course in my entire life. And so I was completely unaware of these issues, and you know, I had to quickly try to do this. So my awakening in the multicultural arena came at Washington State University. As I said, that even though I was teaching the multicultural course, it really wasn't part of my identity until Harry Broad came to campus and said how important it was to connect with your own community. And then I started really internalizing this. I must also say that my first two Ph.D. students at Washington State University, Dottie Morris and Kelly Wilson, also kind of helped awaken me to this issue, because when I was teaching multicultural psychology, they were amazingly enthused about it, and I saw how enthused they got, and that had an effect upon me and really started helping me understand how important these issues really were. However, because I was told to teach multicultural psychology, never having taught a course, I never had a model of how to teach this course, I've had a lifetime of trying to figure out how to do this. And so even though at the time, and still now, my research interest is in how metaphors are used in political persuasion, my multicultural writings have gotten much more national interest, and so now here I am finding myself writing a textbook on how to teach multicultural psychology, even though I had never had a course in multicultural psychology before. This is kind of my lemons to lemonade lesson later on, is that, you know, I was putting so much effort in trying to develop my multicultural course at Washington State because I wanted to do a good job of teaching the course. And so since I was putting in so much effort, I went to the chair of my department and I said, I know that I said that my research area of interest was in metaphors and political persuasion, but I'd like to add multicultural psychology to it, so I'd like to have kind of two major areas of interest. And she said that was fine. And I ended up getting tenure on the basis of my multicultural writings and not on my metaphor writings. Okay, so when I left Washington State and I came here to Cal Poly Pomona, I told the story about how essentially my chair of the department at Fullerton said, essentially, Jeff, you're a minority, you could teach the minority course. A woman, Marcia Laswell, was one of my colleagues here, and Cal Poly Pomona used to be an all-men's college. And being an all-men's college, all of the instructors were male too. Well, when they decided to go co-ed here at Cal Poly, they also decided to bring in some female instructors, and Marcia was in that first class of female instructors here. And so she said, oh, that happened to me when I first came here, that the president of the university, who was the one who assigned people to teach courses, said, well, Marcia, you raised children, so you could teach developmental psychology. So, you know, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Well, I was telling this story to someone at a mentors conference last year, and she was at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School, and their psychiatrist who was teaching the multicultural psychiatry left, and the chair of the department comes to this one woman who was a psychologist and said, well, you're Latina, so you could teach the multicultural psychiatry course. She had the moxie to say no because she wasn't trained as a physician, so how would she know what drugs interact with ethnic minorities? And so she had the moxie to say no, but that mentality is still around. Oh, you are part of X community, so you could teach X subject. Okay, so lessons learned for me. Racism is not necessarily overt, intentional, nor committed by those with negative feelings towards you. I want to emphasize that my mentor in grad school, Roger Dominowski, really was looking out for me. I mean, he liked me. We played tennis together. We still exchanged holiday cards together. I mean, he really and truly liked me, but he was spouting the prevailing wisdom at that time, and I took it. And Stanley Sue was spouting that same thing at the prevailing wisdom at that time. The chair of my department at Fullerton truly liked me, but she had this attitude, well, you're a minority, so you could teach a minority course. So, you know, that's the nature of covert, unintentional racism. Internalized racism can be just as challenging as racism imposed upon you. I did not have the moxie to say, nope, I can't teach multicultural psych because I've never done it. Well, I just kind of took that in and said, okay, well, I'll do what you tell me to. And so I could easily have said no, and I would not have put myself through hell trying to stay half a week ahead of students at that time. So what you do with racism is up to you. You could either fight it, tell them no, I'm not going to do that, or, you know, somehow or another resist racism when you encounter it. You could try to circumvent it. There's a story that Justin Lin tells. Justin Lin is a movie director, a film director, and he was asked to do the film Fast and Furious 2 or Fast and Furious 3, one of those. The one in Tokyo Drift, anyway. And he wanted to use Sung Kang as one of his actors, and the studios told him no, that he needed to interview, I think it was Bow Wow who ended up getting the part that Justin Lin wanted Sung Kang to do. So what ended up happening was that Justin Lin found a creative way to circumvent it. He said, okay, well, I want Sung Kang to read for the main part, and the producers allowed him to read for the main part knowing that they were going to select someone else. But they were so impressed with Sung Kang that they allowed Justin Lin to create a different character for Sung Kang. And so now Sung Kang is in all of the Fast and Furious films. You could go with the flow, pick your fights. If someone asks you to do something and it has racist underpinnings, but you don't think it's important enough to fight it, you could go with the flow. It'll, make life easier for you. Or find creative ways to make lemonade. And so for me, what ended up happening was that I put my anger and upset about being asked to do multicultural psychology, which wasn't my topic, I ended up making it my topic.
As a leader in higher education, Oxford University Press is committed to broadening the ways in which faculty can share and discuss cutting-edge research in the discipline. Our Psych Talks and Cultural Psych Talks seminars showcase the authority, innovation, and excellence in the discipline. If you or someone you know would be a good candidate to lead a session, please reach out to us at jane.potter@oup.com. Bookmark our webinar site to view a schedule of our upcoming live webinars. Browse by session and sign up right on the site. To provide feedback on today's session, please visit the following link and fill out a short survey. You will automatically be entered in a chance to win $50 in OUP books from our Academic and Trade Division. Your feedback will also help us to refine our presentations going forward. And lastly, you can always visit our website to see Oxford's growing array of psychology titles. Thanks for visiting, and we hope to be able to connect with you again soon.